Hey, welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're going to be jumping into a video a few years old of Ben Shapiro interviewing Dr. William Lane Craig, who of course is a Christian apologist who's really a brilliant person. And Ben Shapiro is pretty sharp as well. But this is one of the very few times, maybe the only time, I've ever seen Ben Shapiro really stuck for words. Stick around to the end of the video. You're going to see what I'm talking about. So let's dive into it.
Let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well,
Okay, before we answer that question, so we already have a presupposition here that Jesus legitimately lived and presumably died, because everybody dies. So if you're coming into this video thinking, oh, Jesus is just a myth, no, he's a historical figure. Whether you believe he was the Messiah or resurrected from the dead, okay, that you can believe that or not believe that. But to say that Jesus didn't exist, that's kind of ignorant. It's just like saying Abraham Lincoln didn't exist, or name your historical figure, from whatever, however long ago. There's more evidence, okay, that Jesus existed than many other historical figures that most people don't have a problem saying existed. So he's a historical figure. But what did he actually believe about himself? Okay, so all of the stuff was written about him. What did Jesus have to say about himself? Good question.
first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am."
Yeah, so, Jesus wasn't just a teacher, okay? He didn't believe himself just to be a rabbi or a teacher. It's the old, I believe, C.S. Lewis, moniker that he's either a liar or a lunatic, right? Or if not those two, maybe he is actually Lord of all, right? So yeah, he wasn't just a good teacher. He never gave us that option. He was either Lord, all right, God in the flesh, because that's what he said he was. That's who he said he was. So either that's true or he's crazy. Kind of those are the options, right? And again, historical figure Jesus.
And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even.
Right.
There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Jesus didn't just say he was the Messiah. He said he was God in the flesh. Okay. It's a little deeper than just the Messiah.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel.
Really need to read Isaiah 53, 54 a little more in depth.
Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense. Presumably that would be actual blasphemy.
Yep.
It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified.
Yep.
Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held?
Good question.
And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead.
Ding, ding, ding. There you go.
Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before.
Is raising someone else from the dead a lesser thing than raising yourself from the dead? I don't know. It's a good question.
Where we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be...
Oh, before we get into that, you know what? One of the things that have been going around in my head watching this that I was kind of wondering, should I talk about this? The Bible is so full of things that if you were trying to write a story to present yourself, to put out a new religion, to make yourself, look good so that you have followers wanting to follow you, you're probably going to leave out a lot of the things that the Bible actually reports, okay? We see this sorry time that Jesus is getting dragged before, the Sanhedrin, and all this kind of terrible stuff happens. The disciples, are embarrassed, or they're full of fear, and they abandon Jesus at the cross. He just brings up the fact that the women were the first ones. His women followers were the first ones to show up at the tomb. And I'm going, back in those times, it's a very patriarchal, I can't even say that, a patriarchal society where, women were looked down upon. And if you were going to present a new religion, you probably wouldn't elevate women to be the ones that were the first ones to discover who Jesus, that he rose from the dead, or from anything else. If you were trying to present this new religion to anybody back in those ancient times, you wouldn't have women so prominent involved in this, right? And so all that to say, it was just important to know that the New Testament, okay, is unlike any other document really that's ever been written, really, okay? Historical, corroborated by lots of evidence, and we know that the early church, the disciples, the apostles, they turned the world upside down, and they died for their faith, okay? Nobody in their right mind would die for a lie, something that wasn't true, something that they knew was false. The disciples went from a sorry bunch of people that had no courage to stand up to all of a sudden put their lives on the line, and indeed giving their lives for the cause of Christ. The only thing that could have explained that is really the resurrection of the one whom they followed, Jesus.
That various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number 3 would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
Yeah, just like I said.
The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those 3 facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the
Or another theory is that while Jesus wasn't actually dead, that he merely fainted from exhaustion or blood loss. That's one of the theories that are out there. But you know what? The Romans were killing machines. They knew how to execute people. They know there's no evidence anywhere that's ever been unearthed really that Roman crucifixion was ineffective. They knew what they were doing.
Original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these 3 facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And
the hallucination theory is simply when, the fact that all these people just hallucinated that Jesus was rose from the grave. And the New Testament talks about there was one instance where 500 people seen him at one time, I believe. I'm not an expert on this, but that seems a little weird that many people would have the same hallucination. And if people were hallucinating this, it should be pretty easily debunked then, you would think, right?
And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
Uninteresting. That's Ben's way of saying, I'm not going to argue with anymore because I got nothing. And that's very much not something he's accustomed to. Very brilliant guy. I appreciate Ben Shapiro and a lot of what he does, a lot of what he presents. But William Lane Craig, very brilliant in his own right. So anyways, thanks for watching this video today. God bless you. You know what? If you've made it this far, you're an awesome person. And hopefully we'll see you in the next one.